Welcome to today's webinar, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very conscious it's not easy to find time in the current circumstances, so it's brilliant to have so many people here today. So thank you for making time. Hopefully on the screen you can see that we've got some details about today's event. We've received lots of thought-provoking questions from the hundreds of people who've signed up. Please do keep the conversation going by making comments in the Zoom chat or tweeting, tagging @ambition_INST or using #AmbitionWebinar. We're really keen to hear your thoughts on the topic and thank you for taking the time to engage in the session. Ambition Institute is hosting this webinar today. We're a national charity with a mission dedicated to helping educators serving children from disadvantaged backgrounds to keep getting better. We do this by providing training programs that support educators at every stage, from newly qualified teachers through to leaders of multiple schools. So you can see this webinar as at the beating heart of what we do. My name is Matea Marcinko. I'm a Learning Design Fellow at Ambition, and I've been focusing my energies on the design of our Curriculum for Senior Leaders programme since January of this year, which feels like a very long time ago now. Prior to that, I worked on our Expert Middle Leaders programme, developing our suite of curriculum case studies with experts in the sector, covering 40 subjects from early years to sixth form that we use to demonstrate good practice of curriculum design. Alongside our curriculum principles, these inform the design of our curriculum programmes. We've got a fantastic lineup for our panel today. All three of our speakers are published authors, but also active school leaders, meaning that they've lived through all the recent turbulence. Firstly, we've got Sonia Thompson, who contributed to Research Ed's recent guide to the curriculum and is also head teacher at St Matthew's CE Primary Teaching and Research School in Birmingham. Secondly, we have Kat Howard, who's the author and co-author of two #1 bestsellers, Stop Talking About Wellbeing and Symbiosis, the Curriculum in the Classroom. She's also assistant principal at the Duston School in Northamptonshire. And last but not least, we have Oli Knight, co-author of Creating Outstanding Classrooms, a Whole School Approach, who's also the principal at Acton Academy. Previously, Oli was the principal at Phoenix Academy, taking the school from inadequate to good in 18 months and increasing combined outcomes in English and maths from 39% to 64% in 2 years. As I said, that's quite a panel. Our topic today is tackling lost learning through curriculum design. As teachers, we know that the disadvantage gap existed a long time before COVID. In 2017, the Education Policy Institute showed that the disadvantage gap gets wider and wider as children go through education, doubling by the time they leave primary school and then doubling again by the time they leave secondary. There's no solid evidence or consensus yet on what impact COVID might have on the disadvantage gap. But a recent estimate from the Sutton Trust suggests a 34% loss in learning for children from lower socio-economic groups because of school closures, compared to 21% for children from higher groups. The huge challenges that COVID has presented are nothing like what we in our lives as educators have ever seen before. Schools are having to make incredibly difficult decisions at pace. We know there are no quick fixes or silver bullets, especially in the area of curriculum. Individual schools and their leadership teams need to work out what they think is right for their context and learners. Today, we'll hear from our experienced panel on how they've gone about making these very difficult decisions in their schools and how this has worked out so far. I'm now going to ask each of the panel to introduce themselves. We're going to go in order of the slide I showed earlier, so Sonia, Kat, and finally Oli.
Hi, I'm Sonia Thompson. I'm the head teacher of St Matthew's Teaching School and the director of St Matthew's Research School. We are a school that is in Nechells in Birmingham, inner city Birmingham, in an area of high deprivation, but we don't let that stop us. We're very committed to our community and to our children and ensuring that this interesting and challenging time is as productive for the children and teachers as possible. So that's me.
Thank you, Sonia. Can I come to Kat?
Hi, I'm Kat Howard. I'm Assistant Principal at the Duston School in Northampton. We're an all-through school, so 3 to 19, including our sixth form, with approximately 2,000 students currently on roll. We're incredibly diverse demographic in the community that we serve, and we're currently on a trajectory of improvement as such, particularly around our journey around whole school curriculum and subject level curriculum.
Great. And finally, Oli.
Hi, great. So I'm Oli Knight, principal at our Acton Academy. I think we're very similar. We're on, I suppose, hopefully quite a steep improvement trajectory, which is why this has been a really interesting kind of topic to be thinking about, because it's fairly similar in my experience from a transition school. So the predecessor school was placed into special measures in 2017, and we're now kind of rapidly trying to improve outcomes, work on school culture, really invest in and develop staff to hopefully give the children the kind of education they deserve.
Thanks so much, all of you. So in crafting the questions for the panel that we'll be posing tonight, and we've drawn on those submitted in advance, so thank you so much for those of you who've submitted those. Please do remember to put any comments you have in the chat, and we'll seek to respond to those as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask our first question. So what is the role of curriculum in responding to lost learning caused by COVID? Sonia, can I come to you for that one, first of all? What's the role of curriculum responding to lost learning caused by COVID?
I think curriculum is it's your key driver, really, because, of course, pre-COVID, pre-lockdown, you would have had your school improvement plan, and you would have had some clear kind of markers for what your school journey would have looked like. Of course, that's been disrupted in many ways, but I think most schools' overarching principles are around ensuring that children reach particular targets. And I'm not necessarily talking about just data targets, but particular outcomes for pupils by the end of their school year. So I think the curriculum and readjusting the curriculum in light of COVID still means that we've got to think about those targets and outcomes for children. This is their only school year. 2020, 2021 won't come back again for them. So it's about being very mindful of safety, but also being very mindful that the learning outcomes for children need to be strong, particularly in areas like myself where we're in a high area of deprivation. This leg of the journey for them is crucial. And when we pass them on to the secondary schools, we've got to be confident that we've done the very best that we can do. And as I said, we've got to be very mindful of staff wellbeing and staff safety. But for me, all of that is part of the curriculum, is always all that is part of the thinking that as leaders we have to, leaders and senior leaders, that we have to do around ensuring that our core purpose, which is making sure that the children reach their outcomes, is done in a constructive and a safe way as possible.
When we've talked before, thank you, Sonia. When we talked before, you spoke about the potential for COVID to be all-consuming and how you sort of navigated that in light of your school vision. Could you say a little bit about that?
We're in an area where our parents are very aware of COVID. When we came back, we're a school that with quite high attendance. We were always in the 97-98% pre-COVID. When we came back, we were down to 89-90 because our parents were in that community where they're very, very aware and worried, as they should be, about COVID. So, but it was a case that when we were thinking about children coming back, we were very aware that the more time that they're out of school, the more that gap grows. And in an area of high deprivation where we are, where children come in 18 months behind, we know that we've got a job to do, and we know that is something that we focus on, we work on. And although we haven't abandoned that, we've just had to realign it. We've just had to rethink it in terms of bubbles bursting, people being away. How do we ensure that journey this year is still going to be smooth, is still going to involve? We've got one of our, in terms of our school culture, ours is courage, attainment, pride. Wear your cap with pride. And we want the children to be courageous about the time that they're in. We want them to attain. That's the core thing we want them to do. And we want them to be proud of the fact that they have buckled down in our school, no matter what's going on around them. And it's been challenging, but they know that the core purpose for us and for them is to ensure that this year has some good outcomes at the end of it. So our kind of culture and value system, which I think was embedded before. So it's been great to see that embedding of it. Even online, we've had children, we're a Church of England school, we've had children talk about, you are the light of the world, with God nothing is impossible. And we've used those statements, and the children have used those back to us to really encourage each other to say that we've got to get through this. We've got to get through this in the best way that we can. And it's been really positive to see that. And as I said, I'm not taking away from any difficulties or any challenges that we've had, but it's about reimagining what we can do and making sure that we don't get lost and consumed, which is very easy to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Sonia. I love the idea of the students repeating back to you those kind of truisms that you use amongst staff as well. And that seems like a really kind of empowering image as well. Oli, can I come to you to ask kind of what role has curriculum had in the strategic decisions you've made this past year as a school? So kind of what role has curriculum had?
Yeah, so I kind of echo, I suppose, what Sonia's saying, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I think there has been a bit of a silver lining for us, potentially as a transition school, with, I think the initial school closure afforded us quite a lot of space and thinking time. And so I think that our primary aim during all of this has been to address, I think, what was a very, very poorly thought out, incoherent curriculum model that we inherited, but also to address the really poorly developed schema and limited prototypes that I suppose our children had, rather than can they execute pre-rehearsed skills or whatever it is. And so we had the whole of that summer when schools were shut and we were teaching online, just focusing on curriculum. We did loads of work with Christine Council. We redesigned kind of the model. We invested a lot of training in staff. And so I think operationally, we focused on kind of responding to the pandemic, which I think is probably the right thing to do. But strategically, it's not being part of any of it. I mean, the only strategic kind of issue we're addressing is curriculum design and curriculum thinking. And coronavirus to us is just an operational issue to solve, which I think is solvable through kind of different kind of systems. And so the crux for us was, let's use this time to really think about the reason why the children haven't done well and don't do well is because we haven't got a really well thought out sequenced curriculum model. Like, we think they can't do kind of Y because they don't understand Y, but it's actually they can't do Y because they haven't been taught X. And so we spent a lot more time resequencing, reordering, reclassifying the content than we did on anything else. And so the whole of the summer and the whole of this year so far has been spent around staff training, staff development, around curriculum design. So I would argue it's the only strategic thing we've really been focusing on.
That's really helpful. We've had a question from Ben from the John Lehman High School, who said, will or perhaps should the pandemic lead to permanent change in the way we think about good curriculum design? I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think what it hopefully has done is given us, not forced us, it's enabled us to actually think a lot more about curriculum because of these gaps. And I think so often, I think this is actually probably what great schools do anyway, but this is just on a slightly larger scale, is we really think about reiterating curriculum, really think about have we got the order right, really think about what are we teaching in for me in secondary in year 7, and why am I teaching this in year 7, and how does it prepare them for what they're going to encounter in year 8, in year 9, in year 10, in year 11. So my hope, I suppose, is that it affords us the space, because I think it has created space to think about curriculum in a more sophisticated way than perhaps we used to think about it, which was I think we used to misdiagnose knowledge gaps as skill errors, and I think this prevents that, I suppose, from reoccurring. So I would hope it leads to I'm really interested in it, so I really hope it does lead to a long-term change.
Thank you, Oli. And we've had a few questions about assessment and exams, which is understandably a really pressing topic for teachers right now. And we know that assessment is crucial to informing our curriculum adaptations, but we also know that valid and reliable assessment is hard to achieve and time consuming. So I want to turn to this question of assessment and to think about how you've used assessment effectively throughout this term. So Kat, could I come to you first to answer that question? How have you used assessment effectively throughout this term?
I think there's, just kind of echo Oli really, I think there's a real danger of using language around curriculum and lost curriculum, and that is unavoidable. That's time that can't be gained, and then reverting to this idea of catch up. And I think assessment has unfortunately been the vehicle with which that sometimes manifested itself within schools, that we've seen assessment as our tool, when actually it doesn't necessarily do what we want it to do. And so there is a danger there, and you do see this in some contexts of curriculum catch up being or consisting of weighing the pig a little bit. We do need to really think quite carefully about the fact that what we're putting in front of students, how we're making those choices around how we scaffold that in such a way that it's not detrimental to their ability to be able to, you know, sit an exam at a later point, that we're not just assessing and reassessing and reassessing and reassessing, because that necessarily doesn't free up any time for teaching and you know, and the kind of nuts and bolts of our curriculum delivery in the first place. So I think there is a slight danger of that when we talk about assessment in relation to lost time as such. I think what we can think maybe a little bit carefully about is how to use assessment in a way that informs our teachers, and really thinking about the micro level of how our classroom teachers are using assessment to inform their next steps, and be quite responsive in relation to what students do or don't know. And so moving away from summative assessment to actually, where are we providing opportunities for students to provide them with examples of what success looks like? How many times are our students, now that they're back in the building, particularly with year 11 in mind and examinations in the summer, where are we providing them with repeated, carefully scaffold opportunities of what success looks like before we put that assessment in front of them? And so I think for us, in our context, we've used assessment in a way to inform our next steps, and being really responsive about and communicating this with staff a great deal around the fact that we don't just plough on regardless through our curriculum sequence, but actually it's equally as important for us to revisit what students don't know, because as Oli said, if they don't know X, then we cannot continue to plough through onto Y, because we know that there's an exam in June time. And so actually use your assessment to determine at classroom level a almost bespoke experience within that curriculum, that wider curriculum framework of what do students do or don't know, and then how do we go about taking a best bets approach to resolving that. And so assessment is, as I say, I think it's an informative tool at this stage, rather than, you know, data should be used to inform, not dictate. It should provide us with a narrative rather than, you know, water stops as such.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Kat. When we spoke previously, you talked about harnessing the knowledge from Key Stage 3, and that I think there's sometimes this fear that students are kind of starting this year with a blank slate. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about kind of harnessing that knowledge, the power of retrieval, and how you've gone about that.
Yeah, I mean, for as an English specialist, but this has kind of worked in across the school as well. We teach conceptually so that students are explicitly revisiting key concepts across the curriculum, so that you're able to have those conversations. And that's not just from a from a confidence point of view for the student to understand that they're not starting with a completely blank slate. We're not coming in having never seen any of this before. It just feels a little rusty and it feels out of practice. And that's actually what we're seeing with students, that it's more the practice of writing and applying that knowledge than actually the knowledge. And by having those explicit conversations through retrieval practice of going back and saying, where have we seen this before? Where have we experienced this character, this representation, this idea through all the way back to 12 months, 2 years, 3 years ago, so that you're really harnessing what's come before in your curriculum. And this is where, if your curriculum sequencing is on point, this is where you can really harness that and utilize that, so that students become more and more aware and more familiar with the fact that when they're exploring particular literature or particular concepts, that they have already experienced them before. And so I think there's a lot of value, a great deal of value in having those conversations with students at quite an explicit level, again at class 3 and delivery, around the fact that the information that's being given to them is not brand new. And that can it's like I said, I think there's a danger of us, to our own detriment, of filling time, when actually, instead of slowing down, having those conversations with students about what they already know and building on that, I think is really important.
I think, thank you. I think that's a really lovely point. And you talked about the kind of Machiavellian nature, I think, of kind of Lady Macbeth, and then when they came to looking at different characters, and I thought that was a really lovely way of thinking about it, that sort of conceptual understanding.
Yeah, it's like that, where have we seen we've seen these characters before, we've seen female representation within literature before. Draw on that knowledge and really use that to enhance your understanding of the current situation, the current character, the current theme. And actually students have really run with that, and I think confidence in themselves, confidence of their and understanding that they are confident with the curriculum is such a key component. We know how fundamental motivation is, but motivation alone, they need to understand, they need to recognise their own success.
Thank you, Kat. That's really helpful. Oli, can I come to you to sort of talk about some of the maybe difficult decisions you've had to make as a head teacher in the area of assessment, and how you've sort of navigated that this term?
Yes, seems to be the perennial focus of a head teacher, making hard decisions that no one likes, and everyone thinks it's a stupid decision. But I suppose I was going to build on what Katin as well, but I feel like being in a transition school is a slightly different experience, because our students don't have a lot to draw on from previous years through, for whatever reason, that I think you can run 2 models concurrently. And so we probably are running quite a reductive year 11, year 13, like 1 year program, which is really drilling them for the exams, which is exactly opposite of what we're talking about. But then you have this like longer term model for everyone else. And so I think you have to, some of the decisions we've made that have been really hard, one is sacrificing some of our principles for short term reality, which is, I think, is a really hard thing to do as a head. So I think what we're doing with year 11 probably doesn't fit with the model, but it fits with the reality of their previous experience, and like I said earlier, they're very poorly developed like schema. Like I can't look inside their heads, but they've got very limited kind of prior knowledge and background knowledge, and so we're really drilling them whilst we're developing the kind of prerequisite knowledge for the younger year groups. Other difficult things that we've had to do are around the reality of where they are, where our students have come from, in terms of how many qualifications do they sit? Is it better for them to sit 8 qualifications and therefore free up more time, or should they sit 9 or 10 qualifications and have less time? And so that was a really complex decision to make, because we're balancing out the needs for them to. The more time they have in lessons, the better. And I'm not a fan of intervention. I think we get classroom teaching right. But at the same time, am I limiting their future choices because I'm withdrawing the amount of options that they're doing? Am I narrowing their curriculum experience? Am I taking away from them the one subject that they really love? So these were really complex, difficult decisions, but that were probably the right decisions in the short term. I think you wouldn't make them year on year, you know, in a functioning environment. But that was a really difficult decision. Kind of the decision to sacrifice the model was a difficult decision. And I think we also made some hard decisions around this. This is purely linked to the operational running of the school during a pandemic in terms of bubbles and groupings. Like, how do we organize the school? And we changed around student groupings quite a lot, which is probably suboptimal in some things, and might have a risk of streaming some children and like socially stratifying the year group in some subjects. But the upshot was we thought it enabled us to deploy the right teachers to the right children more effectively. So we had to make balance all these different compromises against our principles, against our like moral compass, with the short-term gain. And I mean, I'm sure we'll look back in 5 years' time and say we shouldn't have done that. That was a terrible error. That was a really bad decision. But I suppose you can only make the decision based on the evidence you have at that point in time. And so they were really tricky leadership decisions to make that will haunt us probably in the future.
I think that's I've seen a question sort of pop up in the chat where someone's asked, like, lots of our kind of views, we've sort of felt that we've gained confidence in them, or they've sort of placated those views, and then so you're sort of kind of reflecting quite honestly with quite vulnerability that actually looking back there might be decisions we've had to make that they might not have been the right ones, or you might reflect on them. Has it sort of confirmed any of your kind of beliefs about what you think about curriculum design, or has it challenged it, particularly I guess in the area of online learning? I guess is perhaps the suggestion in that question.
I have a natural hatred of technology, so I'm probably not the right person. I hate online learning and I hate computers, but I think, yeah, it has challenged us, because we're trying to develop this really pure model of curriculum and really think things through, and just see the exams as this incidental thing that happens, but they don't really matter, and our children are going to do well because they've been really well taught for 5 years, so they've got such broad knowledge of the domain that the exam is really easy, and year 9 was more difficult. But at the same time, because we've got this 1 year, year 11 map that runs counter to that, there's this tension that, I wonder, is that 1 year exam focused drilling model actually going to be more effective? And therefore, are our really pure thoughts of curriculum nice, but do they serve the disadvantaged the best? Because one of the primary things that our children need to leave with is the currency to access the next stage. And so that's quite a challenge for us, because you could probably, drill your kids for 5 years and probably secure okay outcomes. But I think the reality is that I'm hoping, I justify it by saying, but in 5 or 6 years time down the line, they're going to really struggle, because they don't have the knowledge they need to kind of access the national discourse. They can't engage with society on the level that we want them to engage with when they leave. But that's quite a tension, that kind of interplay of those two ideas.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful in how that sort of fits with your vision and your mission for what those students will have, and like you say, the currency they go into. Thank you. Sonia, can I come to you? We've had a question from Anu from the Yardley School. He's asked, what should departments prioritise in the run-up to exams, given the impact of lost learning? And I can also see there's another question in the chat about sort of your learners in Key Stage 1 and 2 and seeing the most significant loss there. So I wondered, as sort of a primary head teacher, whether you could sort of comment on those two questions.
I suppose for us, I say our children came in. We had, as I said, we had very low turnout in June. So we were very worried about how, when we brought everybody back, what that was going to feel like. But it was really impressive to see how, when you do think about curriculum design, and curriculum design is an ongoing, ever-changing thing, but when it's you give people time to think it through, then very quickly you can get up and running with what you need to do. And that's been our kind of core purpose, because of course we were all waiting for announcements about exams and what we needed to do. We know that they're happening. And it's got to be there in our minds that we're working towards something. So now that we've come to the kind of the end of the autumn term, we've been able to see where the lost learning is. And I kind of loathe to call it lost learning, but we've been able to see what we need to work on. But we haven't waited. We didn't wait to do that job because we knew we were working towards something, exams or no exams. We've got to work towards our children being competent, confident, school leavers who go from year group to year group, leave from our school, being able to tackle the next leg of the journey. So we've, as a research school, we're very tuned in to evidence-informed practice, quality first teaching, what happens in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. The evidence is clear. When you're standing in front of the children, it doesn't matter what's happening. That is when you're going to make the most impact. It doesn't matter how strategic and the discussions are at strategic level, if those are not transferred down back into the classroom and we're making a difference in the classroom for the majority of the children day to day, then things are not going to change. So we were very clear about working on those things. So our kind of implementation plan very much focused on the research-informed best bets, as Kat already talked about. What are the things that we know that the research is telling us that is going to make a difference? Quality first teaching, really looking at that. What are the things that in the classroom on a day-to-day basis we need to do? Modelling, scaffolding, chunking the learning, small steps, retrieval, those type, making sure that we're not overloading, there's not a cognitive overload for children. Just reinforcing those particular practices, but also being very clear that if we were going to be taking children out of the classroom so that we could work on interventions, that again, they were proven interventions. We made a decision that some of the interventions that we were going to do, traditionally we'd use TAs, but we made the decision that when it came to fluency in reading is a massive thing in our school, reading for pleasure and reading for progress. But we made sure that the fluency work that we were going to do was going to be done by teachers, because we wanted that practice to go directly back into the classroom so that teachers knew what they were doing outside of the classroom and they could reinforce that back in the classroom. If we were going to let TAs do interventions, then we needed to make sure that there was time within the day for TAs to speak to teachers about what they'd done with particular children, so that again, that learning could be transferred back into the classroom. So I think it's just being very clear about what is your plan. You've got to have a plan as a school. You've got to have an overview of where you want what is this journey going to look like for you across the year? And that's got to be at a strategic level. It's also got to be at the departmental level and at the subject level. So because the journey may well look different, and I'm speaking as a primary practitioner, but knowing a little bit about secondary, but I'm sure Kat and Oli can fill in the gaps. At departmental level, it might look different for maths and look different for English. So it's got to be that leaders are empowered to ensure that their subject areas and the exam pathway for those subjects are clear. There's time, and time is really important. We talk about making changes for curriculum, but without the time to do these things, without the time to think it through, it won't happen. And we've been very clear that everything we do, and as a head who's in charge of several subject areas, when you're in a one formatary school, you've got to do that bit as well. I've got to give myself time. I've got to give my subject leaders time to ensure that the pathway for this year, with everything else, has got to be clear, well thought out, implemented in the right way, and we've done the work to ensure that it's going to work. Too many things that we plan, we've not thought it through, and it doesn't work. And there's a reason why it doesn't work, because it wasn't well thought through. Dylan Williams talks about getting rid of the good. Sometimes we've got to get rid of a lot of things that we did pre-COVID, because now in this post-COVID world, with the children that we've got now in front of us now, it's not going to work what we did before. So we've got to be really clear about why we're doing things.
Thank you, Sonia. That's really helpful. I can see lots of other questions sort of pinging up. I'll try my best to sort of ask some of those as well. But I've got an interesting question about this sort of kind of perhaps lost learning with our year 6 students and what they might have lost in school for the last kind of part of the year, and what secondary schools could do to continue to support the new year 7 students. So I guess this year and into next year. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I'm going to be really positive about my year 6s. They haven't lost anything. They're learning more because we've thought it through. I would say that if you are a secondary school and you've got feeder schools, call them, find out what's going on. It might not be as bad a picture as you think it's going to be. We're really quite positive because we've got a strong learning ethos at the school. The children have come back and the teachers have made it clear. Safety first, but learning second. Safety and learning together. We are driving forward. The children are enjoying their learning. If you look at some of the work that our year 6s are doing, it is beautiful. It's fantastic work. The reading, we've just done some end of term assessments, the reading scores. We're using some of Doug Lamov's reading. He's done a reading curriculum, and we're using
reconsidered.
Yeah, and we're using the reading curriculum that he's got with our year 6s. And I can't tell you the quality of the work. We're very much engaged with reading, as I said, for pleasure and progress. So combining those two things together, we've got high ambition for our children. Certainly my school is not going to pass up year 6s that are not ready. And I'm not saying it's going to be perfect. I'm being pragmatic about it as well. There's children who are struggling, but we're putting in those interventions. We're working with them. So secondaries, trust us. We're going to do as much as we can for you. And we're going to make sure we're sending up children who are confident and competent, and the quality provision is there.
I think one thing that really struck me when I read your chapter and when we spoke previously was kind of the focus on hinterland knowledge, and like really excitingly for me, Andrew's asked about that from Staffordshire University. So would you recommend like evidencing hinterland knowledge? And I know you talked about the virtual platforms that you've used and your students have had access to, and the fact that you're still teaching Latin. Like, can you sort of give us an insight into how you're sort of managing that across the school?
As I said, just a very, and it's an overused word, a very ambitious curriculum for our children. As I said, where we are in Nechells, 5th most deprived in Birmingham, 3rd in Britain, but we don't let that stop us. That has got to be the driver for us to do. And I'm not saying work harder, I'm saying work smarter with our children. I'm very much about our children not being deficit. They're not deficit. What we're doing is building on their existing capital, but there is capital for us to add. There is powerful knowledge for us as schools to add for our children, but that has to be thought out. The schema has to be well thought out, the background knowledge, hence why we've got such a passion for reading for pleasure, because the more children read, it builds the background knowledge, but we also need to be very, very strategic about building that background and knowledge as well. So reading across curriculum areas is really important for us, giving our children as wide experience as possible. We can't go to museums now, but we can certainly do virtual tours of museums. So we've had a Shakespeare company come in and work with our children. So it's about celebrating their heritage, their diversity, what they bring into school. And as I said, it's never a deficit model for me, but also being very clear that we have got powerful knowledge that we want our children to learn, and that's the business that we're in, and that's what we're going to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Sonia. I think I've focused on you as the primary specialist for a bit too long now, kind of getting the most out of you from the primary perspective. Thank you. So we're going to move on to thinking a little bit about the implemented curriculum. And I can see a few questions coming up about that. So Dylan William wrote that the real curriculum is created by teachers every day. And so in terms of how teachers implement the curriculum, what tweaks can they make in their classroom practice to best aid pupil learning? So Kat, can I come to you for that one first of all?
Yeah, I think that's to kind of, you know, I like the fact that Oli hit us hard with a silver lining, because I think that is our silver lining. I think the curriculum is almost what's brought everybody back together, and, you know, almost had a reset, and it was quite nice because we were already on that journey of thinking about whole school curriculum, thinking about developing our teachers as experts, and that continual improvement. And so it's been quite nice to focus all of our attention on curriculum design and how professional development runs alongside that. So that's been really pleasing, I think. I think if you're going to do that, you need to communicate that priority, that curriculum is central to everything else. And I think you do so as a senior leader through your use of time. So we stripped everything away from the calendar, other than anything that was related to, you know, thinking about teaching, talking about teaching, or enabling teachers, subject experts, to develop their craft and have those conversations that we know are so integral to feeding into classroom delivery. Because ultimately those conversations that happen between teachers are what improves the, you know, the way that your curriculum is actualized within the classroom. And that was really, really important. I also think that there was a great deal of and a need for that teachers needed to feel that sense of community, and that reconnection with other subject experts was really quite welcomed. So we increased faculty time. We handed over a huge chunk of our time to subject leads who have curated their own subject knowledge programs over the course of the year. So that runs alongside a couple of things. We run coaching as part of our performance management. So teachers focus on either subject knowledge or pedagogy in relation to the curriculum. And so that subject knowledge professional development aligned with curriculum changes, because you can't review your curriculum and implement something within the curriculum sequence that your teachers don't necessarily feel confident or experienced to teach, particularly with a subject. I mean, any subject. I was speaking to our maths specialists, and I think that it's not as much of an issue with maths, but with English, our degrees are so diverse that you need to make sure that you're thinking of how you continue to have those conversations as subject experts, and that it's okay that our subjects are ever evolving, and so it's okay to have knowledge gaps as a teacher. And actually it's really exciting and interesting to have those conversations about how a particular subject, how Greek mythology has looked in the classroom with year 7, for somebody that's maybe got a background in classics and Latin, and somebody whose background is linguistics, and how actually you know, we create a sense of synthesis between those two subject experts has been really, really interesting. And so subject leads put these programs together to really fall in alignment with the curriculum, and that's done incredibly powerful things for our staff, because it's enabled us to have conversations where I think isolation, the word, has taken a whole new meaning, sadly, and so it's enabled those conversations to take place. But I think as teachers, we are all, I think, too familiar with how satisfying it feels to talk about your subject, and it's a really welcome distraction at the moment. And so enabling that time to take place on the school calendar was really, really important to us, because it enables our teachers to be able to have those conversations, and then in a very kind of non-judgmental, without accountability. You know, we're not talking about data, we're not talking about outcomes, but we're actually just talking about the nuts and bolts of our subject, which is really, really important. And as you said before, the kind of the nuance of the subject as well. And so it's quite interesting. We have an Acton research team of teachers from a variety of subjects within that team, and to be part of that team, and then part of the English team, we have several English teachers within that, to hear how those conversations then thread towards within conversations between different specialists is really, really interesting, because then you're able to have conversations around explicit teaching of vocabulary and how that's actualized within the classroom of a history classroom compared to an English classroom. I had a really interesting conversation with our science specialist around, you know, the use of catalysts, and we use catalysts to describe Mr. Burling and his connection to Eva Smith's Suicide Within Literature. And then obviously science had already touched base with Catalyst and beat us to it, and how that's, you know, recontextualized within the science classroom. Those conversations, you can't put them onto a document, you can't put them into a school improvement plan, but actually they're so integral to the evolution of your curriculum and moving it forward and progressing through shared knowledge of professionals. And I think that's definitely been our silver lining. It's exposed our teachers' knowledge and how integral that is to the curriculum design as a whole.
I think that's really helpful. And we've had a few questions about that. So both the idea of so I'm going to kind of get the most out of that thinking and squeeze that out a bit more, is like you're thinking about the co-curriculum and how you've constructed that, but also another question about how do you start with the development of a conceptual sequenced curriculum? So does this start with SLT mapping or with heads of department feeding in? So I think really interesting, given your kind of example there about English and science and how that's worked at a conceptual level.
Yeah, I think you have to hand autonomy over that to your subject experts. As a senior, I mean, I'm a senior leader and I oversee English as an English specialist, but then I oversee subjects outside of my specialism. I can create the conditions, I can provide that time for that to take place, because you need time in order to develop curriculum. You can't just say we're doing curriculum now and there's actually no space on the calendar in order to be able to do that. I can ask the right questions. I can equip myself in understanding knowledge structures and sequence, and having conversations about what makes a well-accomplished student in PE by the end of year 9. I'm not a subject expert when it comes to sport. I'm very much reliant on my subject experts, and so that needs to come from our subject leads. And it really is, I think, for senior leaders, it's about having an understanding of things like threshold concepts, the way that knowledge is sequenced, the way that knowledge is structured according to the subjects, that, you know, it looks very different in maths and science according to the arts, and having that knowledge. But as far as a specific subject goes, that's kind of where your limit goes. It's asking the right questions and educating yourself in terms of curriculum. But then when it comes to conceptual mapping, that is a subject lead's remit. You know, they are our professional experts, and so it's really important, I think, that senior leaders understand that the extent of their knowledge is the underpinning principles of knowledge itself, but beyond that we do really need to rely on our subject teams.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I'm going to come to the kind of important question that some people have on their minds, that Ofsted's new inspection framework had been in place for just 6 months before lockdown, and it had a strong focus on curriculum. So assuming that the inspections carry on in restart in 2021, do you think this is still the right focus? I'm going to start with you, Kat, and then I'll go to the other panelists.
Always. I think when we start saying that we're doing things for Ofsted, then it distracts us a little bit. If we're doing things for creating a well-rounded student experience of our subjects in a way that's authentic, both to the practical world outside, when if our student decides to go and, you know, have a thorough understanding of the world, but also a thorough understanding of the academia of our subject, I think thankfully, I think the framework now provides us with the opportunity to do that, and a successful Ofsted outcome is a natural consequence of doing the right things for your children within your context. I am a very strong believer of that, and so I suppose that's a very sideways answer to an Ofsted question. But I think if you know that the principles of your curriculum design and the opportunities that you're giving teachers in order to think very carefully about that, and you're on the right track there, I think that the new framework enables schools to do that now in a way that maybe we weren't having those conversations before.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Oli, can I come to you with the same question? Do you still think it's the right focus? And kind of, if not, what do you think the right focus should be?
I totally agree. I think I think I've mentioned Ofsted once since I arrived at Acton. It's not part of our language or our framework, and so I think if you've got a school full of subject experts involved in deep curriculum thinking and improving their subject knowledge and imparting that those habits, not just the knowledge, but the kind of the tentative and revisable nature of a disciplinary curriculum to your students, then I think that to me are the hallmarks of a good education. And if that's coupled with, and we have a big co-curricular program that's really important to us, that so that our students don't just have like the academic promise, they also have developed skills and experiences and hobbies and passions and suffer in the cold and the outdoors or whatever it is. All these things I think are important. Then I think we're delivering the education our children deserve. And I think as Kat said, I think you're going to likely to get a positive Ofsted judgment, and it is a judgment, because I think you're offering a high quality curriculum. And so I mean, that's not really answering the question. I suppose fundamentally, I'm really pleased that there's now a focus on curriculum over and above something like thinking skills or BLP or whatever the other kind of fatty things were that are happening in like the 2008 inspection framework. It was all about teacher performance. So I'm glad we've moved away from the teacher as performer, and we're now looking at a more coherent model of what quality education looks like. But yeah, we wouldn't use it as a framework for us. It doesn't guide any of our thinking. What guides our thinking is more the work of kind of what do our children need to live a kind of life of choice and a life of opportunity, and then that to me is the education that they deserve.
Thank you. I think it's really helpful, and I think what you've all sort of drawn on is the importance of subjects and your subject leaders as well, and the sort of opportunities they have to think about the subject as kind of a distinctive thing and something that kind of requires kind of detail and thought and time to give it that considered approach. So I want to turn to thinking a little bit more about professional development, since it's something that we've talked a lot about and seems to be a key part of your school's kind of response to dealing with COVID. Alex Quigley stated that curriculum development must rest on teacher development. So I wondered what professional development looked like in your setting this term, and if you could kind of detail a bit more what that's looked like. And I think a few questions have come through about teacher knowledge gaps and how you've perhaps tackled that. Sonia, could I come to you first for that one?
I think I talked at the beginning about our kind of implementation plan for this year, coming off the back of the kind of time that the children were out of school, and being very clear that we had kind of three priorities around the kind of 3 tiers: high quality learning, what our targeted academic support would be, but also what our wider strategies were. In terms of the quality, the teaching and the professional development around that, we were very much focused on, we pulled out, we looked at the Great Teaching Toolkit, the kind of evidence review that came out of that just provided a really good summary for us of what are the key things that make the difference in the classroom. I can't stress enough for us how important being very evidence informed about our professional development, how important that is for us. We're so mindful of teachers not being able to stand in front of the children because of isolating, and you don't know from one day to the other who's going to be away. So as I said before, that time that we have in front of the children has got to be as powerful as possible, has got to have such potential. And if the professional development that we're organising is underpinned by that robust evidence and that expertise, and giving and of course in primary we're not necessarily subject specialists, so it is about giving everybody time and planning out the professional development so that there's a coherence and a sequence to it, and we're not just scattergun doing random things, but we've thought through that process for teachers and giving teachers time to talk with each other, discuss with each other. One of the things that we've done this year is we do subject weeks. We're just in the middle of our geography week, where we teach geography and nothing else for a week. rather than teaching it every week bit by bit. So we do a lot of geography input. It ends up being a lot across the year, more than I think we were doing before. We taught it bit by bit, but it means that we were able to do some insight around it a couple of weeks before we have our week. The subject leader then works with each individual class teacher and goes through their schema with them, goes through the plan for the week with them, and plots out what that inquiry question outcome will look like and what the kind of recording and evidence base for that will be. So for me, professional development and time for teachers to work on that and discuss that and work together on that is really important. But again, that's got to be planned. It can't happen accidentally. It won't happen if it's not planned for.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Oli, can I ask you about autonomy and collaboration in curriculum design? So sometimes there's a bit of a tension, I guess, in schools. So what's the sort of place of autonomy but collaboration as well within curriculum design?
Yeah, it's a really complex question because we've kind of sacrificed the autonomy of the maverick on the altar of like collective responsibility. And so I think where we are, I would argue, I think the elephant in the room, in the teaching profession that's probably been resident for some time, is that I think teaching is a profession without a practice compared to a lot of other professions. And so for us, the implementation and success of a disciplinary curriculum model requires a different way or a new way of thinking about teacher effectiveness. And so we have a really heavily codified model of teacher development and what we think great teaching looks like. And so I think there's autonomy within the principles for sure. Of course, our teachers have to make in the minute and hour by hour decisions. That's part of our repertoire. But for me, teachers, we don't shut our doors and are left to get on with it, and we kind of hope for the best. And some children might do really well and some children might not do really well, even if they're in the same school with the same subject, but they get a different teacher. For us, we're really clear that actually there are things that we should all adopt and adhere to because we think they're good bets, and we think the evidence base is strong. And so my view is that you can only really have a curriculum-led model of school improvement if you have a really codified approach to teacher practice, because we know things work and we know that things don't work, and we should stop doing the things that don't work. So I think autonomy for me is a really problematic word, because I don't really believe in it, but also because I think we have to be realistic and we have to be true to the evidence, even when it tells us things we don't want to hear. And so our model is pretty tight, actually, and I think that's what our children require at this point in time. And that might flex over time. So I guess the problem with my experience is that I've only done 3 transition headships. I've never, I've done 3 problems, and so we've always had to be quite tight before we can become really, really loose. And so we're still in a tight phase here. So for me, I'm not really answering the question. There's autonomy within the classroom, but you have to adhere to the set of design principles that we think work best.
I think you've talked about how you've worked with senior leaders. So you talked about kind of thinking about your curriculum training more broadly and using sort of senior leaders or people who have that kind of experience or earned autonomy or have the expertise in curriculum design, and using those to support other leaders or newer kind of more novice middle leaders in role. So kind of through your curriculum design training that you've done this term.
Yeah, I think we have a really good, we do have a good training program, and I think what we've done is what has been touched on previously, is we've given a lot of time back to staff for this. So we've built time into everyone's actual teaching loadings for curriculum thinking, for kind of curriculum analysis, and for curriculum revision. So everyone has 3 periods a week of their teaching timetable where they're not teaching, although technically for the purposes of the timetable they are teaching, where they're all free at the same time within a department to sit down and discuss, I suppose, the impact of what they've been teaching so far, where the students are relative to where we want them to be and what we're going to do next. And that conversation is the best training we can have around curriculum thinking and around curriculum development, because I suppose the reality is that it's the tasks that the children do in the classroom, not what we think we've asked them to do or what the curriculum specifies they should do, that determines what they're thinking about and therefore what they're going to remember and, you know, by default what they've learned. And so our model of having those 3 periods a week really focusing on staff thinking and staff development on curriculum have been really important for allowing heads of department to own the entire process and I suppose to own the reflections and the improvements and the refinements that come from that.
And I think that's still kind of the aspect that gives teachers a lot of fulfillment, actually, and thinking about curriculum and geeking out on your subject and having that time professionally, I think Kat has referred to as well, is something that perhaps previously has been sidelined, but actually putting that at the sort of centre of what you're doing in a school is really important. So I'm going to sum up there. I know we're sort of nearing the end of our time, so thank you all so much. I think we've heard some really fascinating insights. I've been scribbling notes furiously, and so we talked a little bit about the sort of messages from teachers and that teachers are using amongst themselves, some of the vision that you have as a school and how that sort of transcends down to the students saying it to each other and having that courage to say that to one another, as Sonia was talking about. We talked about the sort of conceptual understanding, so how do we move students from X to Y, and what are the steps that we need to take, and often that being rooted in the subject discipline and the conversations that leaders will have together, and giving time was repeated a few times actually, and thinking about how we prioritize that and how we plan for that, and what things that are good that we might need to sideline for now in order to prioritize curriculum in the short term towards longer term gain. We talked a lot about professional development and the importance of that and how that can impact based on evidence-informed practice within the schools that we've been speaking to. So just want to finish with a reference to our Curriculum for Senior Leaders programme, which is you've got some details there on the screen. So it's something that we really believe in. It's a programme that puts at the heart a lot of what we've been talking about in this session. So we really believe here at Ambition Institute that quality teachers have an impact, and so professional development has a key role to play. So lots of themes we've been talking about today. If you'd like to think about those more, you might be interested in our Curriculum for Senior Leaders programme. There's a lot of interest already. So applications are closing on Tuesday, the 26th of January. So if you're interested, I would invite you to apply soon. Before we say goodbye, I want to give a big thank you to our 3 speakers for all their brilliant contributions. So thank you, Sonia, Kat and Oli. And thank you to all of you and the participants who joined today. We've had over 260 people join, which is really brilliant. So thank you, and I hope that you found what we've covered really useful. All that's left to say is I wish you all a very restful Christmas break when it arrives. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your evenings.